Thank you so much. I look forward to it. It's my pleasure to be back for my second spokes session. Today, I have a number of friends and colleagues who will be joining us. Sari Radican had privacy and data protection at 98.6. I knew Sari from her Amgen days and my days with Genentech and Roche. Lisa Wagner, Chief Privacy Officer at TriNet. Lisa has a very interesting job that is extraordinarily pertinent to this conversation. They support about 350,000 employees over several thousand companies, as well as have both internal desires and needs. And then Catherine Williams, who's a very good friend of mine from Novo Nordisk days, who is now the U.S. or the Chief Privacy Officer at Boehringer Ingelheim. So that's who we have with us today. Virginia McSwibna, the Global Chief Compliance Officer and Global Chief Privacy Officer at Agilent Technologies, is here also. Hi, Virginia.
Hi, I'm trying to change my background. Sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. We're fine. And I went the entire last session without it, so we're
all
good.
Right. Okay, good.
All right. So I'm used to seeing you in this. So welcome, Virginia. So one of the things I want to do before we get started out, we have about 65 participants, is to one, say we will be monitoring the Q&As real time. So if you have questions throughout, please feel free to pop them up on the Q&A, and we are not going to wait until the very end to get to all of them. The second thing is, I want, under full disclosure, I want to say that this particular session is not going to be a session on the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act. Some folks who know me, and when this thing first got announced, they say, woohoo, we're all going to get a BIPA presentation, and the answer is no. What we are trying to do is to bring biometrics up into the realm of COVID vaccination status, health status, and other things of that nature. So if you think this is a BIPA session, feel free to choose another session. If you want to go through the vaccine thing and what we're seeing both inside our own companies as well as those we consult with or those we support, that's what today is all about. So Virginia, I want to jump right in, and I want to start with you because you're a Global Chief Compliance Officer, and most of the rest of us are on the privacy realm. And as part of that, you and I had a conversation a few weeks ago, and you said, oh, Bob, you wouldn't believe all the crap we're going through as it relates to, we're a government contractor, we have certain requirements, we have international requirements, we have different privacy requirements. And oh, by the way, we have compliance requirements, and we have factual vaccine cards and not factual vaccine cards, and blah, 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 blah. So if you maybe could put together a problem statement for us and a challenge statement, then I think we can set it and go forward from there.
Yeah, I think the challenge statement is you're a government contractor. The law is unsettled and a moving target, and you are in a situation where you have to decide what you're going to do with your employees in a global situation. Do you require vaccines? How do you collect that data? If you're not going to, what do you do? And then how do you communicate that in a way that's compelling? And when the rules change, what do you do about that?
Perfect. And then Catherine, as you drive yourself across the globe and being relatively new or recently transitioned into your new position, what are the challenges that you're experiencing?
I think, from my perspective, a lot of these things kind of, to Virginia's point, like it's a new area. And I think that companies are trying to kind of figure out how are we going to deal with the requirements. And sometimes that's an 11th hour decision. And so once that decision is made, all of a sudden you have to kind of quickly stand up systems and processes and programs that we're just not necessarily used to dealing with this type of information, kind of where to kind of, store, who's going to support, what kind of vendor credentialing are you going to do of those vendors that will be doing that vaccine credentialing. So I think it's more about, the time to stand up these things and then kind of operationalize them. That is the biggest challenge, both at the, kind of local level, whether it's from the US, but then also how are you going to support at the global level?
So Lisa, you all support several 100,000 employees. You have to worry about your own company. You have to worry about all the companies you support. What are the challenges you're seeing? The other two are in life sciences. Sari kind of splits the difference. What are you seeing from an employer or employee support perspective that maybe we aren't seeing in life sciences?
I don't think a lot of the challenges with what exactly does all this mean and what do we have to do are different from my seat in the movie theater. From an employee perspective, I'm concerned about making sure that we're transparent with our colleagues. Listen, we're going to start collecting health information now to thwart communicable diseases. So when we first started doing this, one of the first things I did was we got to update our privacy policy. Our people need to know, hey, we're collecting additional information from you now. This is the reason that we're doing it, and this is what we're going to do with it. And then making sure, to your point, Catherine, that you touched on, that wherever we're collecting this information is secure. Our access controls there. Has security done a review? If we're using a vendor to process some of this information or collect it for us, have they gone through our TPRM process to make sure that their controls are as stringent as we need them to be?
So Sari, okay, so we have life sciences and we have employer-employee. Now you're with a company that provides remote health services or virtual health services. You're a HIPAA-covered entity. You have what I call private subscriptions, personal subscriptions to the services you provide. Plus you have large employer subscriptions who is part of their employee wellness programs. What are the challenges that you're seeing as it relates to the information that individuals are trying to protect themselves, as well as what employers are wanting to hear from you about the services you provide to their employees?
Thanks, Bob. It's a really good question. And if it's all right with you, I'd like to speak about it both from the 98.6 perspective or the healthcare provider perspective, but also I recently came to 98.6 after being at Perkins Coie as outside counsel for several years and several clients, both within the health and life sciences space, as well as those outside in other verticals. So what I'm going to share with you today is more of a mix of that type of perspective, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, of course. I think the 98.6 has certainly direct correlation, but then just from supporting litigation or being litigation support on the privacy and security side, and then we'll lend that back down into Virginia. We'll just go around the circle, but I think that helps set a stage.
Sure. Thank you. So I think there are a couple of things that we've been thinking about, or I've been thinking about as somebody who's practiced in this space for about 25 years, which is typically we haven't collected employee health data outside of perhaps either medical leave or accommodations. And so this is something that's impacting everyone across the company. And so important to make sure, as Lisa mentioned, that we are updating privacy notices, particularly for employees. And something as a California-based privacy attorney, many of us updated our privacy policies or employee privacy notices in the last couple of years with the CCPA, but there was a lot of confusion that I heard about, well, this is health data. Is that exempted from CCPA? Well, no, because the CCPA exempts PHI, and depending on how that information is collected or created, it may or may not qualify as PHI. So from a provider perspective, and a provider who's an employer perspective, we have those same challenges trying to figure out and stand up a program where we are, number one, providing the requisite notice, but also making sure that it's safely secured, separate and apart from any personnel data, and making sure that only a limited number of people in the right positions with the right roles are able to access that. From the provider side, what we've seen, which is very interesting, and I hadn't experienced this before, so it's been a great learning opportunity for me, is how does a provider address or respond to employer requests to verify whether somebody has been vaccinated or was perhaps the recipient of a work absence letter, if somebody had been maybe exposed to COVID or was feeling very sick or had long-term COVID symptoms, like a COVID long hauler, and how much can we share? How much do we want to share? And what's the difference between, as you mentioned, Bob, the patients that come to us through an employer-sponsored health plan or benefit versus patients that sign up directly to receive our services as like an over-the-counter type or DTC type subscription?
So Virginia, so before I do that, what I want to do first is, I said this wasn't going to be about BIPA, but BIPA is very interesting to me because it even describes levels of biometrics that I've never even contemplated being biometrics, AKA odor, right? And those of us in life sciences, I spent years with things like malignant melanoma and ear lesions saying that's an identifiable type thing. I've been in facilities that are using facial recognition to take temperatures. I've been in facilities that you walk through some sort of a scanner and it goes beep, beep, beep. And I was talking to a GM guy today and he's telling me about the plant type stuff that they're beginning to do. Virginia, from a compliance perspective and an employee monitoring perspective in the global environment, how do you wrestle with the types of things that Sari and Lisa were talking about a minute ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's an ever-changing universe, right? Like today I woke up and Zimbabwe had a privacy law. Like, would I have predicted that a year ago? Absolutely not, right? Like every day I wake up and a new country somewhere in the world has a new privacy law. And I think people underestimate the differences of them. So I often hear people say, oh, they're all GDPR. And I'm like, you have no idea, right? The changes in the China privacy law are so different from GDPR. The India privacy law, I don't think people understand what's coming with that and what that means for organizations. And so it is significant. And the first thing we do is put it through what we call the washer, right? Like, what does it mean for our organization? How is it going to affect us? How is it the same or different than the things that we already have stood up programs for, like GDPR, like California Consumer Privacy Act, like the Brazil law, right? How have we already analyzed it and where are the nuances, gaps, and differences? But what I think COVID has really exposed in some ways, for better or worse, is the gaps in these privacy laws, is the challenges, is the nuance that those of us in life sciences and healthcare have been trying to identify and say, hey, there's some misses here. Like the reason we didn't want employers covered by the California Consumer Privacy Act, like it did not make sense. There are already employee laws out there, right? And so when Sari talks about that, right, like that's all the flashbacks come back to me, right? All the reasons we kept saying employers shouldn't be included here, right? There are, many reasons why employers test employees for things like tuberculosis. In many cases, there's, a drug or alcohol when there's an accident, right? It's just, this is the scale we've never seen before. And it is something I think none of us anticipated. And I think at the beginning of COVID, what it was people were clamoring for data and information. So there was this huge push in my mind to sort of avoid the privacy conversation, like safety mattered more than privacy. And now what I'm seeing on the other side of it is from an employee perspective, employees are saying nothing matters more than my privacy. And it's a very interesting dichotomy in my idea. That's sort of how I see the weighting. And from a compliance person perspective and just my personal perspective, safety is the most important thing there is, right? For me, it's people die and everything else, right? And so that's sort of how I always frame my programs, like what is the most important thing? And this is in the people die category. And so that's how I always have to weigh out privacy in relation. But suddenly we're seeing this huge shift, right? When it came to sort of the entire globe, everybody was like, privacy aside, let's all do COVID. But right when we're coming back to this, you might lose your job if you're not willing to even tell us your status. Suddenly, privacy is the most important thing to employees, and it's very interesting to me.
If I go ahead, Catherine.
So, and Virginia, I think that's spot on. I mean, I do think, though, one of the things that I think is interesting as well in terms of the balancing of individual employee privacy and kind of, you know, this notion around employee safety, is that your business partners can kind of take that employee safety idea to an extreme. And I think that's where you really need to kind of sit down and have conversations with partners and leadership to really explain, okay, what's ultimately the benefit, right, that we as an organization will receive from collecting this information. So when you start, you know, Robert, going into kind of some of the details around biometric information and different things like that, of course, that can have value in certain settings, but in other settings, maybe collecting kind of temperature and tracking and monitoring doesn't necessarily, you know, create the same safety benefit that you would otherwise get kind of in, you know, more of maybe like a day-to-day like manufacturing plant or something like that. So I do think it's really trying to kind of get down to what are the objectives with why you're collecting the information, what are we trying to accomplish, like what are our safety concerns, and then how can we really kind of target that type of information that's going to support that? Because I've seen it kind of swing in a total, oh, well, now that we have this, and to your point, like the data analytics, let's start tracking, let's start monitoring. And then that can just kind of create a whole constantly updating privacy notice, an inability to keep up with kind of employee transparency. So I think it is an interesting discussion that's happening because there's two, I think, separate sides of that, that kind of perspective, and balancing that and kind of getting people to kind of come together and be reasonable in their approach sometimes can be tedious.
Yeah, and you kind of balance that again with the occupational health side. You know, historically, there have been the animal labs, there have been, you know, the DOT physicals, there have been the mandatory drug testing, all of those other kinds of things that were held over there in Occ Health. And now we have general HR that has access to outside of the benefits program, which oftentimes you go the employer self-funded HIPAA covered entity thing. Outside of that, we may have a group within HR that's responsible for tracking vaccine status. And all of a sudden, folks are coming in and saying, I want an exemption based upon a health condition. And well, now you're collecting health status outside of vaccine status. Or people are coming in and saying, I want a religious exemption. Or people are coming in and saying, I want a union exemption. Or it has to be negotiated with my union. So then all of a sudden, I'm thinking GDPR. Race, ethnic origin, political affiliation, trade union membership, sexual orientation, and health status or criminal history, right? Ignore the biometrics and the DNA stuff. Those are core elements that are now being made available in many different ways. And I think about places where I can walk in the door and I have to take my temperature and sign my name. All of a sudden, everybody can see what my temperature was that morning. So Lisa, transitioning to you, from an employee support or an employee spectrum, how do you deal with this?
I think one of the things that's really important is the people that make these decisions or want to make these decisions, whether it's HR or your health and safety team or whatever. If today we're only collecting temperatures and tomorrow they want to start collecting, you know, hair color or whatever else they want to collect, that they know who you are as the privacy professional at the organization to try to talk things out. You know, we assume a lot of risks here if you want to start collecting all this additional information about why, for health reasons, they can't get the vaccine. A simple yes or no, I have the vaccine is one thing, but then when we go, no, I don't have the vaccine because I have, you know, glaucoma or whatever, and I couldn't get the vaccine for other health reasons, then the company's collecting more and more information that we have to worry about the safeguards and the transparency that we're collecting more and more information. So I think that a huge piece to all of this is making sure that the people that make these decisions on what more we want to collect and what more we want to do know that there's privacy implications to be had, and there's protections that will need to be put in place for every single bit of additional information that we collect, in addition to the transparency aspect of it. And do we really need it? If our sole intent and our purpose, and we have a policy that we're here to help, for health and safety reasons, thwart the spread of disease, if that's what we're trying to do we actually need all this other information? Is it our business purpose? Is it being met by only this little bit of information? And let's just stay with that. We don't need to collect additional stuff for no reason.
So, I mentioned the word HIPAA a while ago, and I talked about, just for a quick second, employer-sponsored benefit programs. And traditionally, many companies have had employer-sponsored benefit programs, and therefore they have a HIPAA-covered entity inside human resources. But now we're beginning to look at a different story. I mean, even if we go to Texas, we have Texas Health and Safety Code 181 that basically says, even if you aren't a HIPAA-covered entity, if you collect the health information of a Texas resident, thou shalt comply with HIPAA anyway, right? We call it HIPAA on steroids. So at the same time, companies are trying to use this information. And Sari, I'm coming back to you because you and I had this conversation. In Virginia, I know you and I have had this conversation about validating results and what people do. So Sari, I think you were talking to me about Adobe Acrobat and access to Adobe Acrobat. And then Virginia, you can talk a little bit about what you've seen from validating vaccine cards, and then we'll swing on around. But Sari, you're being asked by employers to validate vaccine status or leaves of absence associated, and it's not necessarily matching up all the time, right?
Correct. And I've had a number of clients in this situation as well, Bob, where on both sides of it, right? Where you're the healthcare provider and maybe you did issue a leave of absence note or a work excuse note. And then the employer wants to come and say, did you really give this note? And did you really give it for this long? And did you give it twice in a row? Or did you extend it for this amount of time? Or the flip side is true, where maybe we're representing the employee or the employers, and they're saying, it just doesn't make sense. I don't quite understand why the work excuse letter maybe has a different font, or the date is slightly askew from where it was before. And so how can we make sure that we are keeping our broader employee base safe, but also holding people accountable for being truthful in the way that they're requesting time off. And I think, in 2020 and early 2021, we had a number of these requests come through from employers saying, I need you to validate that you gave or that you issued this work excuse letter. Well, in some circumstances, we can say that matches what we have in our files, or we've counseled people to say, yes, there was a date or there was a visit on such and such date. And in those circumstances, we can do so because of that employee or employer group health plan component of HIPAA. But my counsel, whether it's to 98.6 or to any of my previous clients, was you can only provide that minimum amount of information necessary for that legitimate purpose. We can't give them we shouldn't be giving them a copy of that. We shouldn't be saying, oh, that was a fraudulent letter. That they asked us, was there a letter issued on this date? We can consider that, was there a visit on that date? Because that's the only way we would have a record of whether or not a letter was issued. And that's how we've gotten comfortable with saying yes or no. But then you have other employers that we're not contracted with. So for example, if I had my own private subscription to use a telemedicine platform like 98.6 that my employer isn't sponsoring, I would need, as the privacy officer at 98.6, I would need to get that patient's authorization to share that information. And oftentimes the employer doesn't want to go seek that. They don't want to clue the employee in on the fact that there might be a potential concern about his or her honesty or truthfulness about his or her health status. So that's something that we struggle with.
So, Virginia, one of the first conversations we had on this subject matter was vaccine cards legit or not legit.
Right.
And notice of collection, right? So maybe there's something in there that you can add to what Sari was just saying.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing we have to do when we receive cards is validate them, right? We can't just take them at face value. And we found during the course of validation that it's just like any other document. And there are reasons that we've learned that some encryption software makes some documents look as if they are fraudulent when they may not be. And so that's one thing for people to be aware of. The other thing is there are essentially mills on the internet where people can, get religious and disability notes of exemption for specifically these purposes. And so you'll see an employee in one state that has a pastor 4 or 5 states away of a different religion than they purport to be, who's, essentially asked for a donation in order to get a letter. Those are the kinds of things that we're seeing. There's a whole series of chat rooms and blogs on the internet. If you want to find them, you can, about, how to essentially fake accommodation requests, whether they be religious or disability. And, employees around the globe are aware of them and are sharing them with one another. And there's often a very small portion of an employee population who's very vocal about the issue, but it only takes 1 or 2 people to be active on the topic for it to create disruption and issues for other people. And it's a challenge. These decisions are not made lightly. Certainly, I don't know any employer that, wants to terminate employment over this, particularly in this economy. And so I don't think that anybody makes these decisions lightly, but at some point, we as a federal contractor had to make a decision, and certainly then standing these programs up was difficult. And now as we stand them up in Europe, now we're facing works councils who are, talking to us about even different issues about where we store the documents, right? And so it's challenging all around.
So, Catherine, from a global perspective, Virginia first, you brought up employees are sharing this information around the globe.
Yep.
This is not a US-based problem. The US is not the only place that has anti-vaxxers or however you want to refer to it. So, Catherine, how do you synergize a global program considering the types of scenarios that Virginia was just talking about?
I think, that it's difficult, right, to synergize a global program. And I think when you say synergize, I think you need to kind of come up with some big picture processes that are going to work across the globe. But then you're going to have to be able to take into consideration specific jurisdictional issues, requirements, et cetera, that allow you to do the things that are necessary to, again, protect, employee safety, but at the same time honor privacy, which means that you're not going to have kind of like a plug and play process for each specific jurisdiction. And you really then have to kind of collectively, as a network of privacy professionals, discuss the issues that you're seeing, come to the table with kind of specific pain points in your jurisdiction, and find the common themes, and then kind of take from that what you think can be operationalized everywhere. And then also what kind of customization are you going to need to kind of roll out to address local concerns. So I think it's really kind of being proactive and making sure that you have that forum to have that discussion.
So, Lisa, have you seen any or heard from the hundreds of thousands of people that you all support anything about discrimination based on health status, limitations on career advancement, or concerns of employers specific to those types of things? I mean, you have a view much differently, I think, in that regard than some of the others.
So not that have made their way to me, and I'm going to knock on wood while I say that, as if that helps. So no, I haven't heard any claims of discrimination or anything like that based on what we're deciding to do with respect to requiring vaccine or not.
Are you aware of any, are any of you aware of use of any technologies that are internal or external? We have a question from Virginia Bartlett. It says, what technologies are companies using to validate health or vaccine status? And is there a benefit to using a customer-driven vaccine status app? I'm thinking of something like Clear or something along those lines, which put the consumer in control instead of the employer. And what's the downside of allowing consumers to validate their information in a consumer app? Anybody want to take that one?
I'll start. So
Yes,
we aren't using one, and the reason is we need to be able to tie it to employees. I mean, right, like the whole point here is we have a massive set of data that we have to tie to employees, and just at scale, it's not easy to do. I think if you had a company that was under 5,000, that might be more reasonable, but at a certain size, I think it's really hard to do. And at the time that we have to do it in is the other challenge we're dealing with, right? I mean, these programs have to be done yesterday, essentially. And so decisions have to be made, and implementation, as Catherine and others are saying, the operationalization is at the speed of light from a program standpoint.
I also though think, I mean, you know, what I've also seen is kind of there's the interim solution and then the long-term solution, because I do think it's also important to note that just in terms of like time to operationalize, you know, the return to office dates are moving targets, the what we are going to require moving targets. So figuring out and really kind of taking like a thoughtful risk-based approach, like what can we do right now to get exactly what we need to kind of achieve our purpose, and then realizing that these are, you know, as much as we'd all like kind of at the end of 2020, you know, everything to be okay and reset, I think we're going to be living with these things and these issues for a while, right? Like we will have to deal with variants and potentially new, you know, types of communicable disease. It's just something that I think is just the way of the future. So really kind of making it known that we need to have a viable long-term solution. And I think in that regard, what, you know, I've seen, at least kind of in like the pharma and the med device industry, is investment in kind of, again, more kind of customized solutions for your organization where, you know, Bob, you do have that app that allows kind of more of a user-friendly interface for employees to kind of upload documentation, and then a longer term, more viable option in terms of validation of data. So I think, but again, that's not something that you stand up overnight or in kind of like the 3 weeks that you get between the phone call of the decision and then when they need that go live. So I think you need to kind of think about, okay, where's a temporary system that I can host this information, migrate that over, identify the right people to be supporting that, and make sure that you purge, right? Like, I think that's the biggest thing, right? Like when you're copying files over, make sure that there is nothing being left behind or you don't have inadvertent access, but come up with a plan that allows you to kind of do a short-term, long-term.
So Siri, has anybody come to you all to looking for internal support technologies, since you guys are already out there, or collection of vaccine information in support of a corporate initiative? Has somebody hit you guys up for that yet?
Actually, no, and I'm surprised by that, Bob. But no, we have not been hit up for that. But we are also not in a position to be validating whether somebody received their vaccines. We're not providing vaccines, so we get that question quite a bit. But we're not in a position to validate those. So. Like you said, you know, I'm sure that there's something that we will be hit up with, but we haven't seen it yet.
So Lisa, if we come back and think of the non-life sciences, non-medical side, how are you transitioning through all of this, considering the challenges that the other folks are mentioning?
So I just want to touch on the use of a third-party app such
Oh,
as
please,
Square.
yes, go ahead.
So I think that may allow organizations the ability to transfer a little bit of the risk, right? So you're not actually housing the cards because the end user downloads the Clear app and uploads their card themselves, or however it works for Clear to validate on our behalf. One of the things that I think is really important about the use of a third-party app, and I'm sorry that I say this word an exorbitant amount of time, is the transparency to our colleagues that, hey, here's our return to office policy. Just so you know, we're requiring vaccinations. In order for you to validate your vaccine status, you need to go to our third-party provider and you will upload your information there. You're not giving it to TriNet, it's a third-party provider. And that if you choose to use a third-party provider, you've reviewed their terms of use and privacy policy. And obviously your contract guys have made sure that everything's in there from the perspective of what they're gonna do with this data on our colleagues, because we're asking our colleagues, we're basically mandating that they go use this one particular app and upload their health data. And so we want to make sure that we do a great security review on them, that we have all the contractual provisions in place with them, because we're making colleagues use one particular app or another or whatever. And then back to, again, being transparent with our colleagues. Hey, you have to do this, just so you know, you're giving it to our third party. Yes, we have reviewed them, they're good, but just want to let you know before you upload your data, you're accepting their terms of use, you're acknowledging their privacy policy.
So it's not unlike using a third-party app to apply for a job, or HR using a third-party app to conduct a background investigation.
Right.
I've worked with companies that have received the entire background investigation, and then I've worked with companies that receive a yes or no from having successfully passed. One of those is much riskier to the employer than the other.
Robert, I
ahead.
do think there's a big difference, at least kind of in my experience, in terms of, and I think this is why kind of going back to companies making the decision that they were going to kind of develop their own apps and their own way of kind of collecting it, leveraging a third party for some of it, but maybe not all of it, is that obviously the COVID vaccination data in aggregate form has a tremendous amount of value. And I'm not saying that kind of background data doesn't, but I don't think that there's maybe quite as a market for kind of like the resale of that aggregate value data. And I do think that employees, you know, to Lisa's point, are very attuned to, well, how are people using my information? How is this being used? Like there is a bigger, at least just in my experience, a more visceral response with employees, given kind of the, you know, the hot button issue here, that they're willing to go ahead and kind of have someone go ahead and do a full background check without asking any questions. But when it comes to handing over that vaccine information, that's really different. And so when you look to and point to terms of use, right, is that something that your employee base is going to be comfortable with? And I think really kind of going through that process and making sure that you have leadership understanding and awareness. Like if we go down this path, you may have people really kind of not want to participate in that program. So I think even more than just like that kind of standard privacy and security review, you're looking much more holistically on kind of what is the reuse of the data and kind of the secondary use in a way that, you know, you really need to kind of then be thoughtful about and have like Q&A and FAQs ready for those employees that are going to ask questions, and really make sure that you arm your HR partners with that information so that you can kind of get ahead of some of those issues.
So have any of you all set up different security policies, different records retention policies, anything else specific to COVID that did not fall into your historical security controls or historical data retention controls? I mean, are you purging it after 3 months? Are you purging it after 6 months? Have any of you all set those things up yet?
We obviously, and I know we've talked about kind of the fact that we have employee covered benefits plans, which tend to obviously be HIPAA. I think we've, you know, one of the things though that's interesting is just in my experience that tends to get outsourced to your kind of third party insurance providers where most of that HIPAA data goes. So at least from kind of like the general operations of a pharma manufacturer, we don't typically kind of house that level of sensitive data on our systems. Our clinical teams, again, that's a different scenario, but that's a totally different arm. So we've really had to kind of set up and stand up systems, processes to kind of align with HIPAA. That you can't, we're not kind of dumping this in personnel files. We're really going to kind of keep this confidential. So it's not something that just gets kind of thrown into that general employee process, where that's been very different for us.
So, Sari, one of the conversations you and I had was specific to your history as a litigator. Or no, I'm sorry, not as a litigator, but as a privacy person in litigation support, right? Mm-hmm. What are you hearing from your litigation friends about COVID vaccine tracking, COVID, access by employers? What type of stuff are you hearing? Because I know you still have your fingers in the pie, even though you have a new job now.
Absolutely. And I think, Bob, I was one of the only non-litigators in the privacy commercial litigation group, because as a longtime privacy lawyer and health privacy lawyer, it was something that I could help the litigators understand and see from an in-house and then, of course, external perspective. What I'm hearing, and again, this is just like you said, fingers in the pie and keeping an ear to the ground, is that they're expecting to see some class action suits in this space, expecting it to be, a violation of privacy or a mishandling of data. Of course, again, being from California, we have a number of class actions pending under CCPA. I haven't heard of any yet related specifically to this, but with regard to breach, there is the private right of action under the CCPA. So I think our litigator friends are looking closely at this and waiting to see what happens. It should be interesting, but I appreciate the conversation we're having today about the different approaches that companies can take, whether collecting that information and storing it in-house or using a third party to store and do a thumbs up, thumbs down. I think that will definitely, those different options we'll learn more about and more about the resulting impact from a class action perspective in the future.
So Lisa, did you guys conduct special training for the people who are dealing this versus the covered benefit, or did you roll it up under the covered entity as part of a HIPAA thing?
So no, we tend to keep that separate. You mean the folks that are managing the vaccine status and all the voluntary return office stuff? Yeah. So special training, which would mean talking to me and getting the fear of Lisa put in you, so we have a rather small shop of people. And prior to this whole thing about getting the actual vaccine card, a yes or no was all we needed. And it wasn't for all of our colleagues across the board, just for the folks that wanted on a voluntary basis to return into some of our big offices. And so the circle is very small on the folks that have access to that information. And they are part of our security team, our physical security team. That's who, and HR is, they aren't told. Lisa Wagner said, yes, she's vaccinated. They're told, because there's multiple things you need to do in order to go into the office. Say I'm vaccinated. I attest to it on a form, basically. And I also have to take a training, not specific to privacy, but me, if I want to go into an office that shows me how to put my mask on, right, or whatever. And the proper protocols for distancing and things like that, should I choose to go to the office. So there are two requirements that I need to meet in order to be RCO. And the folks that know that, if you will, are a very small circle of folks, and they will report to HR. Yes, Lisa has passed both requirements. So it's sort of not quite clear whether or not which one or other I didn't, because there's a couple of requirements in play.
That's really interesting to me that you said the security team is the team and not the HR team, because I think that's personally, and I am the non-lawyer in this group, is personally, I kind of like that idea, because then from my perspective, you have a separation of church and state, and it gets rid of some of the other things that I was thinking about earlier or possibilities. Virginia, one area of yours is privacy and one area of yours is compliance. Is there a difference as it relates to this stuff, or is it all the same?
I think there is a difference, right? And so it's when it becomes trickier, because for me, the compliance hat is sort of the big picture safety, the big picture organizational goal, the big picture values, the big picture standard of business conduct, right? And privacy is one piece of that, but it's that weighing and balancing. And so privacy weighs and balances safety and privacy risk, or right, compliance weighs and balances everybody's risk versus other things. So for me, there is a difference, I would say. And the world is becoming more complex and more challenging. The privacy laws are becoming more complex and more challenging. I don't even think that, for example, the way that India has pulled their law together, it's sort of, as they describe it, it's the best of all the laws in the world. But does that make for a great law, right, is the question. Does that all tie together in one law? I think, the questions that I think about are, did employees really understand that privacy laws applied to them, right? For me, there's still this huge distinction that I think needs to be created in privacy. When I think about privacy, when I think about compliance, right, it's what does it mean for our employees? What does it mean for our partners and customers, right? And our partners, and then what does it mean for our customers? And those are really three different things, and they mean three different things. And this is the first place where I think you really see it, right? Yeah, we changed the privacy notices, but it's also about really communicating with your employees in the way you typically communicate with your employees, which is not a privacy notice. I mean, to be realistic, how many of them read the privacy notice? That's not where they go to get employee information. And I think that's interesting, right? And the same if we were communicating with our partners, right? And many of them are hospitals, and they're communicating with us about who can come on site to service their instruments, right? So for them, that's very important. And then, I think those are all really different pieces and parts. And as the compliance officer, I have to think about them all and think about them differently. And so it's not just about what you do technically, but how you both operationalize and, more importantly, communicate, because the policy is one piece of it. But at the end of the day, that's not how people internalize both the understanding and how they actionize.
So I want to remind all the attendees that we do have a question and answer box that's open if they want to ask anything. So quick reminder. Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, I think it's interesting that you kind of, Virginia, come up with the three buckets, because I do agree with you that historically, we have looked at kind of our stakeholder groups differently, right? But I think that actually kind of goes back to what type of information are you collecting, right? And I think really kind of cultivating a privacy program, right? That engenders trust. And I think when you talk about, at least kind of, in the pharma industry, if we're going to be interacting with, patients, we want them to feel as if they are informed, right? And that they trust us to kind of leverage and use their information in a way that, protects their privacy. It's now kind of cropped up in the employee context. We really haven't necessarily had to think through that before, which is interesting, because we have collected kind of in the notion around reasonable accommodations and,
Yep.
things that the employee is getting a benefit from. But you do have to kind of sell them on this a little bit to let them know that, look, this is for safety. This is why we are doing it. And we are not going to be over collecting. So I think it kind of goes back to the not being too overzealous in the safety space, really being thoughtful. And then, Lisa, to your point about the notice and kind of clear communication, but also making sure that there's alignment across all different functional areas. So the same talking points and the same things are being used. You don't want any kind of cross wires where someone's saying yeah, we're going to use your information and we'll report back and we may use it for this and this and this. Because I think that's when all of a sudden you kind of run into a problem. And again, operationalizing that whole kind of communication stream, pulling in the right, that's a lot to do in a short period of time. So I think that's where a lot of the challenges are as well. But treating your employees like they're your patients, right? Like, because I think that's it. They need to feel comfortable with giving you that information. They need to know why they're doing it.
So
I always think it's me too. It's my information too. I'm one of those employees. So how do I feel about it?
yeah, no, that's great.
And I know how the sausage is made. So
yeah, and that's,
rest assured, if my information's on the line, we're talking business.
Back in the day in Virginia, you may remember this conference. You and I were at a legal conference together, and the Global General Counsel said the biggest damage we could suffer would be the damage of reputation. And it's not the financial harm that many boards are worried about, particularly in this job market. It's the reputational harm that companies can suffer. And yes, you could lose a contract, but if you lose, we always talked about, particularly in biopharma, the loss of image to our patients that we serve. And there's Poneman Institute studies about, if a healthcare patient has the option, they'll go to a different healthcare system. And if a banking customer has an option, they'll go to a different banking system. Well, we all know today employees are jumping jobs every time you turn around. And where boards are really concerned about fiduciary responsibility, shareholder value, or personal risk and liability, in the end, the viability of companies is based upon the respect the employees have for that company. So and I know we're getting close. We got about 6 minutes left. We have no questions pending, but I'd like to give each of you all a chance to kind of wrap up and think about it from how do you advise your leadership on risk and the right thing to do? How are you advising your brethren within your companies? And what are the challenges that you see in the go forward? And I think, Sari, I'm going to start with you because you are a healthcare provider versus a healthcare user. I mean, you all have employees, but you really provide healthcare. And if you had to tell people what you're sensing, how would you advise them to approach this with their boards and senior leadership? And then I'll just go around Virginia, Catherine, Lisa, and if you guys hear anything, feel free to jump in. I don't want to miss out here on anything. So Sari, I think we'll just start with you.
Sure. I think we mentioned it a few minutes ago and throughout our conversation today. It's all about trust, right? It's about it's about focusing on the communication in the right way, in the right channels to make sure that those who entrust us with their data trust that we'll do the right thing with it and by them. And so whether it's as a healthcare provider or when I was the global chief privacy officer for a biotechnology company, my takeaway has been then and has continued to be that we need to make sure that those that trust us with their data are comfortable doing so. We are transparent with them about what we're collecting, what we're creating about them, how we're using it, how we're sharing it. Because if that trust is ever doubted, then it's not just going to doubt the way, or it's not going to just cause people to doubt their trust in how we handle their data, but it can expand into other areas, whether it's how they trust our business processes, how they trust the types of devices or biologics that we're creating or the process in which we research. So to me, it always boils down to trust and transparency.
Thank you. Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, someone recently referred to me as the anti-lawyer, and I see it as sort of the highest compliment, right? The brand of compliance and privacy that I want to bring is clear, easy, and actionable. And the more complex the world and the laws become, the more important that becomes to me. I don't want my teams and my clients to have to worry about whether this is Brazil's law or GDPR or India or China's PIPL or data security law. I want them to worry about the principles of privacy and transparency, notice, consent. And then at the end of the day is just because we can do it, should we do it? And if we should do it, then how do we make it clear what we're doing? And so that's really what I come back to every time is that, and it's going to have to go beyond policies now. And one of the things I love about HIPAA that other laws are lacking is security. So I really believe in security for privacy more than anything.
Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to kind of piggyback off of what, Virginia said, I think, regardless of where you're located, right? Although it's difficult to synergize, we want to look at the individual, right? And so an individual is an individual. And if we have kind of what our core commitment to privacy is going to be, those individuals should be treated the same across the globe. You shouldn't just kind of discriminate against individuals because you can. So I think there's, what we can do, kind of focusing on the individual and then really making sure that we are adhering to that consistently. And so I think that's not losing sight of the fact, and Lisa, I think you hit, like, this is someone's information, right? And we need to make sure that we always keep that person in mind and don't lose sight of that.
So Lisa, I'm going to let you wrap it up before I say a couple of words and turn it back to Camille.
Sure. Reputational damage, hands down, the biggest risk, the biggest damage, in my opinion, we could suffer. Money's money, hard come, easy go, we'll pay the fines. We lose a customer, we lose a colleague because they don't trust us, they may never come back. And in my mind, that's the worst damage we can suffer.
Well, I personally thank all of you. I'm privileged to count each of you as my friends in the privacy world. Some longer than others, Virginia, but many of us have been around the block together, have challenged these. I look forward to working with each of you. I know that we're all available for outreach. I'm only as good as my network is, and you all are, I'm privileged to call each of you a piece of my network. So thank you so much. And with that, Camille, I turn it back to you.
Oh, well, my pleasure. And what a pleasure to be part of this conversation. We're concluding our conversation on the use of biometric data, the challenge of managing employee healthcare data, particularly in this era of COVID. And we're looking forward to the next session coming up in a minute on digital advertising, the global privacy patchwork. See as many of you as we can very soon. And the next panel will be headlined by the moderator, Michael Hahn from the IAB. Thank you very much. And thank you, Robert, and the panel.